Hello and welcome back into this week's episode of the Everyday Strength Podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Hagele. Today's episode digs into the topic that your training should revolve around the activities that you actually enjoy. Now, I get the appeal with this. Most of us aren't training inside of a vacuum, right? We've got demanding jobs, we have family responsibilities, and limited time and energy to devote to our training. And building a system that you look forward to, something that fits within your life and allows you to keep showing up, makes a lot of sense. And in many cases, that consistency is what separates the people who make steady progress from those who, either burn out or quit. But here's the nuance that I think gets often missed. When enjoyment becomes the only guiding principle, your training can lose its direction. This is the classic, right? You're still active, you're sweating, you're checking the box, and you're feeling productive. Yet you're not clearly building towards anything specific. Ultimately, you end up with exercise, an activity that feels good in the moment, but it doesn't drive any real meaningful change over time. Training isn't just what you're willing to do, but it's what actually forces that adaptation. At the same time, if you hate something so much that you avoid it, then you'll never accumulate the consistent work that you need to develop the results you're looking for. And so in this regard, enjoyment matters a lot, but it does have to live alongside the real physiological demands of the qualities that you want to be able to improve. So let's make this concrete with actual physiology, right? If your goal is to get better aerobic capacity, then doing more conditioning, more cardio isn't the only thing you need. Okay, you need repeated and consistent sessions, whether that's through running or cycling or rowing, or just doing mixed modality work at the right intensities and at the right durations. And then over weeks and months, that drives those key adaptations. Things that we see in terms of increased mitochondrial density. Your cells' power plants, they become more numerous and they become more efficient. You get better capillarization, right? More of these tiny blood vessels that deliver oxygen and nutrients to the muscles. You also get an improved ability for your body to use fat for fuel. And practically, that means that you can sustain higher efforts longer. You can recover faster between hard intervals and oftentimes just feel less wrecked after a tough workout, after a tough day. And then on the strength side, the process is similar, even if the stimulus may look a little bit different. Getting stronger or building muscle isn't just about showing up and moving heavy weight, okay? It requires that progressive exposure to meaningful mechanical tension, higher force outputs over time, and consistent recruitment of those high threshold motor units. And that's what's going to improve your body's ability to increase that neural drive, that coordination, muscle cross-sectional area, hypertrophy, right? You feel this as just better force, better power production. Daily tasks make it easier, lifting groceries, carrying things, right? And then a more resilient physique, less at risk of getting injured. When we talk about hybrid training or within the science community we call concurrent training, we're describing the process of developing multiple physical qualities simultaneously. That's strength, that's conditioning, that's power, hypertrophy, our work capacity. It's not just a new system that we're talking about with this. It seems trendy now, but this is foundational strength and conditioning. The modern conversation just frames it a little bit differently around these real life constraints. So the goal here can look different from person to person, right? For one guy, hybrid training might mean staying strong while being able to now build a solid aerobic base. For others, it might be maintaining your endurance while trying to add muscle and add a little bit of size. And for many everyday athletes, it's just simply becoming more well-rounded, a little bit stronger, right? A little bit more conditioned, a little bit more capable across a different range of demands without any major glaring weaknesses. But the moment that you develop multiple physical qualities at once or attempt to, Okay, you're going to be forced to make trade-offs. We've talked about this on a previous podcast. You have finite hours in the week. You have a finite recovery capacity and a finite ability to be able to push intensity before sessions can start to compete with each other. And this is where the interference effect becomes important, right? If you push conditioning volume aggressively and then your strength sessions suffer in quality or you lose the ability to recover, you might chase heavy strength gains and then your conditioning output or your endurance adaptations may be blunted. Okay, research shows that this interference effect is often a little bit smaller than what we once thought, especially for the recreational lifters who train with moderate loads and moderate volumes, but it still exists as a real constraint that requires intelligent management. Now, we need to separate two overlapping distinct conversations. The first is training to be a high-functioning, well-rounded individual versus training to compete in a sport, in a hybrid sport, or in some type of hybrid event. For general performance and long-term health, you have more flexibility, right? You can bias toward modalities that you enjoy. You can rotate tools and adjust things week to week based on your schedule and feel. Now, training for competition, it demands more specificity, especially the closer you get to an event. But even then, your off-season phases, they allow a little bit more room for that enjoyment, for more broader base building, doing things that you actually like. And most guys trip up by treating all of this training like competition prep. I see it, right? Things are very rigid. There's no joy. Or they go the complete opposite, where they treat it like casual exercise, working out, right? With no clear progression model. And that's the core distinction that I try to make, is that exercise is doing something. Training, however, is deliberately building towards something. And hybrid training, at its best, is a framework for developing multiple physical qualities, while honestly balancing what is able to drive that adaptation with what you can sustain long term. And those two factors have to be reconciled. We can't ignore them, okay? We can't blindly prioritize one over the other. Now, coming out of that bigger framework, where hybrid training is really about smartly allocating your time and energy across multiple physical qualities. Okay. The next layer is understanding what actually drives your decisions day to day. At that point, you're no longer organizing a training week, okay, on paper or on a log, right? You're constantly navigating this real lived tension between what you enjoy doing and what actually moves you forward. And those two things can overlap sometimes, but they're not the same. Most guys feel this tension the moment that they look honestly at their own training. There are parts where you naturally gravitate toward. We all know it, right? The lifts that make you feel strong, the conditioning that gets your heart pumping and leaves you sweating and buzzing after the workout. And then there are the parts where you tend to push off or shorten or skip altogether, right? You might, especially if you're like me, right? You might love loading the barbell up and going heavy, but then you drag your feet on the longer aerobic sessions. Or you might be able to crush those high intensity conditioning sessions, but then you hesitate when it's time to really load your lower body or grind through heavy compound movements. Or maybe you thrive on short, intense efforts, but then struggle to commit to the consistent, lower intensity volume work. What most people nowadays call zone 2 training, right? That actually is what lays the foundation for a bigger aerobic engine. Now, if you leave training entirely to preference, then most of us will naturally gravitate towards the things that we're already decent at, or the sessions and the exercises that feel the most engaging right now. And over time, we're going to get imbalances. And that bias isn't always a bad thing, right? If you have a very clear goal and that natural preference lines up with it, then you can lean into it. That's smart. And for most of us, though, most of us everyday athletes, that bias isn't intentional. It's just what's convenient. And that's exactly where our progress can start to stall, because the adaptation follows exposure. The physical qualities that improve are the ones that receive the right kind of stimulus when we apply it consistently, week after week, month after month. And then at the same time, if you dislike something enough that you avoid it completely, then you're never going to rack up enough volume or enough quality work for it to actually matter. So this isn't an either or conversation, but it's about finding the balance where the necessary work still gets done and it gets done consistently enough to be able to drive that change. At the surface level, this is where our conversation could stop, right? You have limited time, limited daily energy, and limited recovery resources. If you push one area harder, say adding more conditioning volume, and something else has to give, you might need to dial back strength work or reduce the intensity there. You might push strength aggressively with these heavy loads and high effort, and it can start to drag down the quality or the freshness of your conditioning sessions. And most guys feel this natural tug of war within their body, even if they don't fully understand the why behind it. But underneath that practical reality, there's that deeper physiological layer that explains exactly what's happening. Right? When you emphasize endurance training, especially accumulating higher volumes of aerobic work, then you're activating those aerobic pathways like AMPK. Okay? AMPK is your body's efficiency switch. It signals the cells to get better at producing and using energy. And over time, this leads to meaningful increases in mitochondrial density. Those power plants we talked about, you get more of them and they're better at producing power inside your muscle cells. You also get that improved blood flow, which means, smaller blood vessels that are delivering oxygen, clearing out waste. And then that translates to being able to sustain effort longer, being able to recover faster between sessions, and being able to hold higher outputs without fatiguing as quickly. In this case, right, you simply feel more durable. Now let's shift the emphasis towards strength or hypertrophy. And the stimulus changes dramatically. Right? You're now dealing with high levels of mechanical tension, heavy force production, high recruitment of these motor units. And that pushes signaling down a different road, that mTOR pathway. mTOR is linked with muscle protein synthesis. And then that triggers that cascade of muscle growth and improvements in your ability to produce force. And these two systems, they don't cancel each other out, right? As we know, you absolutely can build strength and endurance at the same time, but they do compete for your body's limited resources and recovery capacity. And that competition is the real basis of what people call the interference effect. Okay, don't view it as a roadblock, but there are clear limits to how hard and how simultaneously you can push both qualities without starting to blunt the progress of the other. And the degree of interference depends on a number of factors. Okay, total volume, how you sequence sessions within the week, and then how well you're able to manage your recovery. And this is exactly why the popular just do what you enjoy advice doesn't work all the time, right? Because the training that drives the most meaningful long-term adaptations is not always the stuff that you naturally gravitate towards. The longer, steady aerobic sessions, the repeated exposures to moderate loads that build tissue resilience, the workouts that don't necessarily feel impressive in the moment, but they, quietly they're expanding your capacity over time. And those are the first things that are skipped when training is guided purely by your preference or your mood that day. And then at the same time, the opposite extreme doesn't work for most of us either. Right? If you build a program that is 100% theoretically optimal, checking every single physiological box, but you completely ignore any sense of enjoyment, any sense of personal preference, and any sense of real life context, then you end up with something that, again, looks perfect on paper, but it's impossible to sustain whenever your life gets hectic, right? And their adherence becomes the silent killer. So you're left with two ends of the spectrum. On one side, entirely preference-driven training feels good, it feels engaging, you look forward to the sessions, but then it sometimes may lack that clear progression and direction. And so we don't get the results we're looking for. Right? On the other side, the entirely optimization-driven training, it hits all the right physiological targets, but it's rigid, it's demanding, and frequently unrealistic for people who are balancing training with a full-time job, right? With family and everything else that goes on. So the real goal here isn't to pick one of these extremes. It's to reconcile them intelligently. Progress still requires the right stimulus applied consistently over time, but that consistency is heavily influenced by whether you can tolerate the process. And in the best cases, even find ways to enjoy parts of it. And when you do this well, then hybrid training stops being about chasing this mythical, perfect program. It becomes, more about building a system that balances structure with real sustainability. Not by doing less work, but by being far more intentional about where your effort goes and how that effort can fit into your life week after week. Now, once you accept that hybrid training is about accepting that balancing act between competing demands, right? Time, recovery, capacity, adaptation needs, and simple day-to-day adherence, then the next question is, what does this look like in practice? Not in that theoretical world, but in the way that your week is actually structured. Okay, how do sessions get prioritized and how your effort gets distributed across these different physical qualities? And this is where most guys go looking for, ready-made templates. They want someone to be able to hand them a 3-day or a 4-day split and say, just go follow this. But what you need is to find that better way to think about your training, right? Hybrid isn't a fixed program. It's not do 3 lifts and then 2 runs per week. It's not a predetermined mix of strength training and conditioning work. At its core, it's a distribution. It's how you allocate your limited training time and your energy and your focus across the qualities that you want to improve based on what actually matters. So I'm going to throw out some numbers here, things like 60-40, 70-30. And when I say this, this is what I mean, right? Roughly 60% of your weekly training time or your total training stress is dedicated to your primary quality, while the remaining 40% supports everything else. So here it's not about counting the exact minutes. It's about where the majority of your effort and your emphasis lands. And that distribution has to be driven by a clear and honest goal. Not a vague, I want to be better at everything, but a specific answer to the question of what do I want to get noticeably better at in the next 8 to 12 weeks? Once that priority is locked in, then the rest of your training can start to organize around it. So let's make this real, right? With a few examples here. So take the guy who's coming from a football or maybe a field sport background, someone who needs a little bit more strength, size, that short burst power. Right, his hybrid training might look something like a 70-30 split, where about 70% of his training and time and emphasis is going towards strength and hypertrophy work. And then 30% is dedicated to conditioning. That conditioning isn't there to turn him into a marathoner, right? It's just there to support that repeat sprint ability and just general work capacity. So shorter, higher intensity sessions, things like sled pushes, farmer's carries, repeat sprint intervals. The goal here is to make sure that he can keep expressing that power even when he starts to fatigue. Now let's flip that for a high rocks competitor or a CrossFit style competitor. Okay, you might see something closer to a 60-40 split with the emphasis reversed. So 60% of their training time is focused on conditioning and aerobic development, and then 40% on strength. Obviously, strength still matters, but the intent now has to change. It's no longer just about being able to move as much weight as possible when fresh, but about producing and sustaining force even when you're already breathing hard and your legs are burning and you're fatigued. And then you have the endurance leaning athlete. Okay, this is the guy who's focused on building just a bigger aerobic engine and sustaining longer efforts. He might run something closer to like an 80-20 split, where 80% is aerobic work, might be running, cycling, rowing, whatever fits, and then only 20% dedicated to strength training, and just enough to be able to support durability and injury prevention. That strength piece is still hugely valuable, but it's not the main driver. And then there's what we call the everyday athlete, the majority of guys who listen, right? You want to be strong, you want to be capable, relatively lean, and well-conditioned without a specific competition demand, okay? Now for you, a more balanced distribution makes sense here. So something in the 60-40 or even 50-50 range, where we're doing enough strength work to build and maintain muscle, and be able to increase that force production, and then enough aerobic and conditioning work to support our health, to support our work capacity, and that feeling of just being fit and being in shape. And then we have enough flexibility tied in to allow us to adjust whenever life gets busy. Even with the same goal and the same distribution, two guys can still build very different programs based on training history, based on their injury profile. What's their weekly schedule? What's their recovery ability, and what they actually enjoy doing? Hybrid training isn't just about the qualities that you're trying to develop on paper, but it's about being realistic with what you can tolerate and recover from and be able to consistently execute. You can design something that looks physiologically perfect, but if it doesn't fit your schedule, or if you dread half the sessions, then it's not going to produce results. And it's not because the science was wrong, but because the plan never got executed the way that it needed to. So when I throw out these distributions, right, 70-30, 60-40, 50-50, you don't have to treat them like strict prescriptions, but just treat them as helpful mental models. A way for you to kind of visualize where most of your time and most of your effort should be going based on your current priority. They're a reflection of emphasis, not unbreakable rules. And where this gets even more nuanced is when you move beyond what you're training and you start looking at how you train it. Right? Even if two guys share the same goal and they run a similar distribution, say going back to that 60-40 range, right, with the emphasis on aerobic development and supporting strength work, then the actual structure may look different. And a big part of that comes down to the modality and how those percentages get expressed session to session. One person might build most of their 60% aerobic block through running, right? Higher weekly mileage with zone 2, some threshold work. And then another might use cycling or rowing to be able to hit higher total volume, but less joint stress. And then a third here might choose mixed modality work to add in variety, right? Physiologically, all of these can improve our oxygen delivery. They can improve our mitochondrial density and those aerobic outcomes that we look for. But practically, they're not interchangeable, especially when you're protecting recovery while still hitting your strength days. Running carries higher mechanical load and impact that demands more tissue tolerance, and it also carries a higher injury risk if we start to ramp up volume too quickly. Now with cycling or rowing, they let you accumulate more of that aerobic volume and far less wear and tear, which often means better quality strength sessions later on. So the question evolves here, right? You're no longer just asking, what do I need to improve? But you're asking, given my body, given my schedule, given my injury risk and my recovery, what's the smartest way to be able to hit my target distribution so that I can sustain it long term? And this is where enjoyment gets to re-enter, right? But we've got to control it. Enjoyment should never dictate your core priorities or your percentages, but it can powerfully shape how you fulfill them. So if cycling lets you consistently hit your 60% aerobic target without getting injured, without breaking down, that's a smart, high adherence choice. If running works and you've built the durability to be able to handle it while you're protecting your strength work, then use it. Okay? The rule is that the modality must still deliver the intended stimulus. And enjoyment is a powerful tool for sustainability, but it's not the foundation. And the better daily question becomes, what do I need to do to be able to hit my target distribution this week? And how can I structure it so that I'll be able to follow through consistently? So to make this concrete, let me walk you through how I'm approaching my own training right now. Okay, my primary focus is on improving my running and my aerobic base while still maintaining strength and maintaining my physique. So I run closer to a 60-40 distribution, favoring conditioning. I still lift 3 days a week, but the intent has shifted. So now I'm not really chasing the max effort work the same way that I once was. And I'm more, mindful of how lifting days affect my conditioning quality. On the conditioning side, I emphasize longer, lower intensity, zone 2 type work as the foundation. It's not always exciting, believe me, but it's necessary to be able to expand my aerobic capacity. Now I layer on higher intensity sessions within that. I mix running with the bike. I use the rower and the skier so that I can accumulate volume without excessively fatiguing myself and interfering with my overall strength work or my overall recovery. And that is what this looks like in practice, right? It's not a random mood-driven practice, okay? It's also not so rigid that it ignores my fatigue. It ignores my schedule or my long-term sustainability. Really good examples here. When life demands an adjustment, I make it. Okay, holidays come up, right? I've got to move things around. I have travel or random things that happen on the weekend. I've got to adjust, okay? But within the framework of my target distribution. So when we zoom out and take a bigger look at this, we can have two guys who can share the same goal and roughly the same distribution and still build very different but equally effective programs. What matters is clear priorities and appropriate methods being chosen for your individual situation, and a system that you can actually execute consistently over the time. So at this point, right, the goal isn't to be able to hand you a ready-made program. I have them available, but that's not the purpose here. It's to give you a way of thinking about your training that holds up over months and over years. And most people, they start backwards, right? They start with the exercises or the split, okay, or what they saw someone doing on social media without having the clarity on what they're actually trying to prioritize right now. The structure won't move you forward. So the true starting point has to be honesty. What do you actually want to improve right now? Is it raw strength, noticeable size, a bigger aerobic engine? Is it your performance in a specific event? Or is it simply becoming more well-rounded and more capable without having any glaring weaknesses? Those goals require different distributions and different trade-offs. And once that priority is clear, then everything else around it can organize, right? Your week can become less about just filling slots with workouts and instead more about deliberately allocating that stress toward what matters most. So if strength is your priority, then protect high quality strength sessions and then let everything else fit in around them. If conditioning is your focus, then structure your lifting in a way that supports your conditioning rather than letting it compete for your recovery. And this is where many people get tripped up, right? They try to improve strength, they try to build muscle, increase endurance, and stay lean all at once without accepting that real emphasis requires these trade-offs. And our progress usually comes from pushing one or two qualities slightly ahead for a block of time while doing enough smart work in the others to be able to maintain them. And then from there, we build the structure around what you can realistically execute. Not what looks optimal on paper. Okay, how many days can you train? How long can your sessions be? Where do you tend to accumulate fatigue? And those details help to determine whether the plan actually works. Enjoyment then finds its proper place, not as the driver of the priorities or the percentages, but as the lever to improve long-term adherence. And once you know what needs doing, then you can choose preferred modalities and you can adjust elements within the structure so that you don't dread going to the gym every session. Okay, there will always be parts that you don't love. The longer aerobic sessions, the lifts that expose your weaknesses, the hard days when you're not feeling it. And those aren't flaws, okay, and they're often what makes the program effective. But at the same time, the system shouldn't feel like it's a constant punishment. If every session feels forced, then there's a sign that your structure isn't aligned with your life or your recovery capacity, right? You're balancing these two realities. Progress requires the right stimulus to be applied consistently over time. And consistency depends on whether the process is something that you can actually sustain. And when those two things align, then your training can feel different. Okay? It stops being about what is perfect, and it stops being chasing that perfect program and starts feeling like executing with a clear direction, but having enough flexibility to adjust whenever your life is dependent on that. And that's what hybrid training should be at its core. Okay? Not another rigid template or just a trend, but a practical framework that lets you develop these multiple physical qualities while staying honest about your priorities and your constraints and the actual work that's required. So if you're trying to build or maybe rebuild your own version of hybrid training, then don't start by asking what looks the most balanced on paper, but instead what matters most to me right now. And then build your balance around that honest answer. In the long term, the everyday athletes who make the biggest and most sustainable progress aren't the ones trying to do a little bit of everything at full intensity all the time, but they're the ones they're clear on their priorities. Okay, they're consistent with the work that needs to be done to move the needle, and they're disciplined enough to show up for the stuff that isn't always fun, while still building a system and a program that they can realistically stick with for years, not just weeks. That's it for today's episode of the Everyday Strength Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, hit that subscribe button. Whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on Apple or Spotify, drop a comment on YouTube or leave a quick 5-star review on your podcast app. It helps the show reach more everyday athletes who train the right way. For weekly performance tools, training insights, and deeper breakdowns on strength, conditioning, physiology, and just becoming a better overall everyday athlete, join the free Performance Edge Network. You'll get the weekly newsletter with the topics I'm exploring, the experiments I'm running, and the practical takeaways that you can apply right away. And if you're ready to train with structure, check out my programs. Peak Performance is the flagship for building elite strength and conditioning. Peak 3X is the 3-day per week version for athletes who need maximum efficiency. And I've got programs centered around hybrid performance, running, and just becoming a stronger, more capable everyday athlete. You can find all of these programs at HageleStrength.com. I appreciate you listening. Keep showing up, keep working hard, and I'll see you in the next one.